On the 3rd of November 1868, John Willis Maynard became the first African-American person to be elected to the United States Congress. John Willis Maynard was born in 1838 to free people of color in Illinois. Educated at an abolitionist school in the small city of Sparta and later at Iberia College in Ohio, he established himself as a gifted speaker, and by 1862 had moved to Washington, D.C., where he wrote for several African-American newspapers. While in the capital, Maynard debated the idea of colonial settlements for freed slaves with Frederick Douglass. This brought him to the attention of Abraham Lincoln's Commissioner of Emigration, who appointed him to a clerkship in the Interior Department. Nevertheless, as one of the first African-American clerks in the federal government, Maynard faced resentment and criticism from his white colleagues and was forced to resign 3 months later. In 1865, Maynard settled in New Orleans, where he established his own newspaper, as well as being an inspector of customs and a commissioner of streets. As an active member of the Louisiana Republican Party, he became their candidate in 1868's special election to succeed James Mann, a Democrat who had died in office. Running against Caleb S. Hunt, Maynard secured approximately 64% of the vote, and on the 3rd of November 1868 became the first African-American person to be elected to the United States Congress. Despite the large margin of defeat, Hunt contested the election, and the two men were invited to Washington, where Maynard became the first African-American man to address Congress. He presented his case in the chamber of the House of Representatives, but after lengthy debate, neither candidate secured enough support from Congress, and the seat remained vacant.
Abolitionist John Willis Maynard was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1868, and although he was never seated, he was the first African American to address the House chamber.
That oftentimes we are surrounded by giants who are in holes, and if somehow or another we can get the dirt from around them and uncover who they really are, rather than being grasshoppers, they become giants, and there have been so many giants.
His main claim to fame is that he was the first African-American elected to the House of Representatives, but he was denied his seat in 1869. We'll get into a bit of the reasons behind that, but I'm here to talk about some of his life, his background, his history up until this point, because he was actually a very accomplished individual who sat at the crossroads of two major events in American history and international history. They were related events. The American Civil War, he had a front row seat to this right here in Washington, D.C. But also, shortly after the war, he migrated to Jamaica and was a participant in a major event internationally, the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865. Both of these events had the connection of being tied to the end of slavery and the establishment of greater freedom, civil rights for the African population, both in the British Empire and the United States. So he had a front row seat to two intersecting events at a very tumultuous time in history. So Mitchell hires Maynard on as a clerk in 1863, which actually makes him one of the first African Americans to obtain a white-collar job in the United States government. He was given an equal salary to the white administrative workers in the Interior Department, which caused quite a bit of controversy.
In fact, the very first African American who ever spoke on the House floor while it was in session was a man by the name of John Willis Maynard from Louisiana. And in 1868, in a special election, he had been elected with 64% of the vote to a district that encompassed greater New Orleans, but the election was contested by his opponent, and when it came before the House Elections Committee, the Elections Committee decided to seat neither of the gentlemen. So Maynard, who could have become the first African American in Congress by a full year, lost that and didn't take his seat. Now, during most of Reconstruction, in both the House and the Senate, a very influential group of individuals known as radical Republicans really ran the legislative agenda in both chambers. And radicals tended to be former abolitionists who wanted to impose a much harsher version of Reconstruction on the southern states than did Presidents Lincoln or Johnson. Wanted this program of Reconstruction to, in the end, create a multiracial society wherein newly freed African Americans would be integrated fully into the political process. There were 17 African American congressmen who served between 1870 and 1877, and they had a lot in common. They all came from reconstructed Republican governments in the South. Most were born in the South. 8 of them had been born into slavery. And it was a time-honored 19th century vehicle for advancing one's political career. A lot of them came from journalism backgrounds with startup Republican newspapers in the South. There was a lot to unite this group. And with their stories of personal triumph and individual moments of heroism, they offered a powerful collective symbol of the victory of African American citizenship and voting rights in those years after the Civil War. But it's important to remember, too, that during this period, these African American members never really achieved the level of power that was wielded by their white colleagues in both the House and the Senate. And in a sense, they really served at the margins of institutional power. And nor did they serve in sufficiently large numbers to really drive a legislative agenda. In fact, the largest group of African Americans who served in the 19th century in one Congress was 8, 7 representatives and Senator Blanche Bruce from Mississippi. And that was in the 44th Congress, 1875 to 1877. These were all Republicans, and they, at that point, were serving in a Congress that was under Democratic control. But they provided first-hand accounts of civil rights abuses against their constituents in the South and often against themselves that got a lot of press attention. Probably the most noteworthy debates in which these African Americans participated related to the Civil Rights Act of 1875. One fellow who was involved in the debate, his name was Robert Elliott from South Carolina, and he is truly one of the more interesting people who we profiled. He was much younger than his colleagues. He had a photographic memory, and he was a great orator. When he came to the House floor, the national press and the galleries took note. He became Speaker of the South Carolina State Legislature, State House of Representatives. But like so many African Americans in this era, Elliott would very soon struggle later in life with the opportunity to participate in politics at the state level, or even eke out an earning. And he died in obscurity in 1884, after Jim Crow laws and segregation had begun to redescend in the South, and he died complications of malaria and with little public notice.
By the time Congress convened in 1866, anti-slavery Republicans dominated both houses. Led by men like John Bingham in the House, along with Senators Charles Sumner and Jacob Howard, radical Republicans enjoyed complete control of Congress.
They have the power to amend the Constitution, and they are determined to use it. They were faced with an unending series of abuses in the Reconstruction South. State and local governments had responded to the new 13th Amendment ban on slavery by trying to deprive newly freed slaves and their white supporters of any meaningful freedom, especially economic freedom. Economic liberty, the right to pursue a livelihood of your own choosing and to keep the money you earn, was the opposite of slavery and the real opportunity for freed slaves to lead a free life. The pro-slavery forces knew this. So in the South, freed slaves weren't just banned from pursuing particular occupations, but in some places it was actually illegal for black people to leave their employer's property without written permission. In others, breaking a labor contract was punished by whipping. The 14th Amendment was supposed to stop rights violations like these.
One of the rights most frequently mentioned in connection with the 14th Amendment was the right to keep and bear arms. Congress was well aware of the fact that newly freed blacks and white Union soldiers were being systematically disarmed throughout the South in order to subjugate and terrorize them. For example, Congress heard testimony about a town in Kentucky where the town marshal was, quote, very prompt to take arms away from all of the returning black soldiers and to shoot them whenever the opportunity arose.
The 14th Amendment was proposed in response to this wholesale violation of civil rights, as embodied, for example, in the notorious Black Codes. The architect of the 14th Amendment, John Bingham, was a learned and well-respected lawyer from Ohio.
Bingham actually appears to have been one of the few members of Congress who understood that by virtue of the Supreme Court's decision in Barron v. Baltimore, the Bill of Rights did not apply directly against the states. In fact, Bingham had to bring a copy of Barron onto the floor of the House to prove that the Bill of Rights had no effect against the states.
John Bingham believed there was a hole in the original Constitution, which was that it didn't give the federal government the power to protect individual rights from interference by the states. The 14th Amendment was Bingham's effort to fix that.
The 14th Amendment protects three distinct interests: due process, equal protection, and the privileges or immunities, meaning rights, of United States citizens. Of those three, privileges or immunities are by far the most important because that clause protects individual rights from government infringement.